Any idea what you want for them?
20,000.
You know, I'm not too sure on the value of dinosaur eggs, but I do know Nicolas Cage paid like $1 million for a Tyrannosaurus Rex skull. I'm not an expert when it comes to dinosaur eggs, but I do know people pay a lot of good money for cool dinosaur stuff.
A restoration expert walked into a Las Vegas pawn shop and examined two unusual objects on the counter. At first glance, they appeared to be ordinary, rough stones, but the woman who brought them in claimed they were dinosaur eggs. If authentic, they could be worth far more than anyone in the room expected.
Well, this egg has been identified as Dendrolithus. It would have been a duck-billed dinosaur.
A duck-billed dinosaur.
Wow.
Upon inspection, the expert's reaction indicated that the situation was more complicated than it first appeared. Before any value could be determined, two questions needed answers. Why did the paleontologist respond so cautiously? And how did 75-million-year-old dinosaur eggs end up in a Las Vegas pawn shop? Join us as we find out all the details. $20,000 worth of confidence. A woman walked into the gold and silver pawn shop carrying what she described as a pair of dinosaur eggs. She wasn't nervous as she set them down on the counter, looked at Corey Harrison, and told him she wanted $20,000 for them. And she believed it was worth every cent of it. And the thing is, she wasn't wrong to think that way. The eggs hadn't always been hers. The most common path for Chinese dinosaur eggs reaching American hands ran through several layers of transaction. A construction worker or farmer in Henan or Guangdong discovers an egg, sells it to a local middleman for a few dollars, and that middleman passes it to a dealer with foreign connections. From there, it travels, declared on customs forms as decorative stone or mineral specimens, to Hong Kong, then Taiwan, then the US, where it surfaces at a rock show, a mineral fair, or an estate sale. By the time it lands on a pawn shop counter, it has passed through so many hands that no one holding it can trace the chain back. That's almost certainly how she got them. When most people hear the words dinosaur egg, something happens in their brain immediately. They associate it with museums and protected displays, not something ordinary or misplaced. The word dinosaur carries a kind of automatic weight to it that almost nothing else does. These were eggs laid by a creature that walked this earth before the first human ancestor ever drew breath. Corey Harrison, Rick Harrison's son, and a man who had spent most of his life behind that counter, looked at the eggs carefully. Right away, a few things were clear. They were heavy. They had real texture to them, not smooth and polished the way a decorative replica would be, but rough and dense, like something that had been pulled out of the earth rather than manufactured in a factory. There were actual chisel marks on them, the kind left behind when a fossil is carefully extracted from surrounding rock. But Corey also noticed something else. There was a crack running along one of the eggs. It looked like something that had been broken and then put back together. And in a pawn shop, a crack is never just a crack. And this crack, as it turned out, had a story buried inside it that would change the value of everything on that counter. Corey knew he wasn't an expert. He knew that looking at something and guessing wasn't going to be good enough here. If these were real, he didn't want to make the mistake of letting them walk back out the door for nothing. And if they weren't real, he needed to know that too. He called in an expert. So what did that expert actually find? And why did it end up making the eggs worth less, not more? The plot twist. Bob Uhas had been the shop's go-to expert on restoration and authentication for years. When examining the object, he didn't rush. That was the first thing everyone noticed. He held them carefully, turning them over, examining the outer shell from different angles. He looked at the thickness of the shell from the side, because that thickness, and how consistent it was from one point to the next, was one of the key markers that separated a genuine fossilized dinosaur egg from a very convincing rock. He studied the color differences between the interior sediment and the shell material itself. And then he stopped. He set one egg down, picked up the other, and said, "These are real." The eggs were from the Dendrolithus species, a type of dinosaur egg found primarily in China and Mongolia, most commonly associated with a group of plant-eating dinosaurs known as hadrosaurs, better known by their nickname, the duck-billed dinosaurs. The eggs date to the late Cretaceous, between 70 and 80 million years ago. They were the real thing. For a moment, no one at the shop spoke. They were all looking at two eggs sitting on the pawn shop counter, claiming to be millions of years old. These eggs were under fluorescent lights, beside a cash register, out of place and unverified. But then the expert's expression changed, and that change told the whole second half of the story. He looked at that crack again, the one Corey had noticed earlier, and what he said next dropped the temperature in the room by about 10 degrees. The two eggs had never been found together. At some point, between the ground in China and this counter in Las Vegas, someone had taken two completely separate eggs, put them together, and deliberately presented them as a natural pair. Assembling fossil specimens from separate sources to create a more valuable composite is a well-documented practice in the Chinese fossil trade. Dealers take genuine material from multiple unrelated specimens, fit the pieces together, fill the gaps with plaster or epoxy, and present the result as a single find. Sometimes it's shell fragments from dozens of different eggs, reassembled to make one complete egg. In 1999, scientists and National Geographic were deceived by exactly this technique. A fossil presented as a single remarkable creature turned out to be the front half of one animal and the tail of another, glued together by someone who understood that a complete specimen is worth exponentially more than two incomplete ones. These eggs were a simpler version of that logic. The crack was the evidence, and the reason someone had gone to that trouble was simple and cynical. In the fossil market, a pair of eggs is significantly more valuable than a single egg on its own. A nest is more valuable than a pair. The more eggs together, the higher the price. So someone had manufactured a story, literally glued one together to push the value higher. The eggs were real, but the pair was a lie. But here's what the episode never told you. The eggs being real wasn't what made them valuable, and the eggs being faked as a pair wasn't what made them cheap. The price was decided long before she walked through that door. How these eggs got to Las Vegas. To understand how those eggs ended up in Las Vegas, you have to go back to China. The early 1990s. At that time, something extraordinary was happening in Henan and Guangdong provinces, two regions in southern and central China that sit on top of some of the richest dinosaur-era geology anywhere on Earth. The rock formations there date back to the same period as the eggs, which meant the ground was full of them. Construction crews were digging, farmers were plowing, and every so often they were pulling up dinosaur eggs. Thousands of them. Enormous clutches of fossilized eggs that had been sitting in the earth for 70 to 80 million years, perfectly preserved in sandstone and breccia, waiting to be found. One site alone at Tumiaoling Hill contained a single nest with 77 eggs. Some locals kept the eggs for themselves. Others sold them quietly to neighbors. But a more organized group recognized what they had on their hands, something that wealthy collectors in Europe and the United States would pay serious money for, and so a network developed. Eggs were excavated illegally, packaged carefully, and smuggled out of China through a variety of channels, traveling across borders with false customs documentation, eventually surfacing at auctions, in private galleries, and yes, at estate sales and collector markets all over the world. The Chinese government moved to stop it. In 1993, local authorities in Henan province officially declared the illegal excavation, buying, selling, and smuggling of fossilized dinosaur eggs to be a criminal offense. The national government followed shortly after, classifying intact dinosaur eggs as state cultural relics, the same legal category as ancient coins and imperial artifacts, and made clear that unauthorized possession was punishable under criminal law. Chinese police conducted raids. Hundreds of eggs were seized. People went to jail. But by then, the damage was done. The eggs were already out, scattered across private collections, antique markets, and curiosity shops on every continent. And that flood of supply collapsed the price. What had once felt exotic and rare had become, in the world of fossil collectors, almost ordinary. A common Dendrolithus egg from China could be had for a few $100s. The excitement of the early 1990s had burned itself out. Which raises the question every viewer will ask. If these eggs were smuggled, how is Corey allowed to buy them? The United States has no blanket law against owning fossils. What's illegal is the smuggling itself, the falsification of customs documents, and the violation of Chinese law at the point of exit. Once an egg has been in private circulation long enough, U.S. authorities need to establish the full chain of custody to seize it, and that chain is rarely traceable. The crime happened at a port of entry, years before those eggs reached that counter. This gray zone was wide enough that for years, fossils from Mongolia and China were openly advertised in American shops and on dealer websites, with some sellers keeping skulls in their front windows without anyone believing it was illegal. And this is the context that nobody on that Pawn Stars episode fully explained. When the expert told the seller her eggs were worth $300 to $600 each, it was the result of a decade of illegal excavation, cross-border smuggling, government crackdowns, and market saturation that had turned what she thought was a $20,000 treasure into a $500 transaction. There's one more detail that connects this story to someone most people will recognize. In the episode, Rick mentioned that Nicolas Cage once paid a huge sum for a T-Rex skull. What he didn't mention was what happened next. Cage paid $276,000 for a Tyrannosaurus bataar skull at auction in 2007, outbidding Leonardo DiCaprio in the process. Years later, Homeland Security knocked on his door and told him the skull had been illegally smuggled out of Mongolia's Gobi Desert. He bought it at a legitimate auction. He had to return it, and he never saw his money again. And as he put it, the whole thing just stank. And back to the eggs. Supply had already decided what those eggs were worth. But to understand why that price felt so wrong, you first have to know what kind of animal actually laid them, because the expert dismissed them in a single word, and he had no idea how wrong he was. Lamest dinosaurs. Bob said it almost as a throwaway that these were duck-billed dinosaur eggs, which made them, in his words, lame. And that is one of the most wrong things ever said in that pawn shop. Because the truth about duck-billed dinosaurs is that they were anything but lame. Hadrosaurs roamed the Earth during the late Cretaceous period, roughly 80 to 65 million years ago, across what is now North America, Europe, and Asia. They were big. Some species reached lengths of 40 to 50 feet and weighed several tons. They moved on 4 legs while grazing and could rise onto 2 when they needed to run. The hadrosaur's primary predator was Tyrannosaurus rex. Being a duck-billed dinosaur meant living in the same world as the most dangerous land predator in the history of the planet, and surviving anyway. But what made hadrosaurs genuinely extraordinary wasn't their size or their speed. It was their behavior. In 1978, paleontologist Jack Horner found a Maiasaura nesting site in Montana with adults, juveniles, and eggs together. And the juveniles' bones weren't developed enough for them to survive alone. The adults were feeding and protecting them. Dinosaurs had parental instincts. Some hadrosaur species had hollow crests on their skulls that functioned almost like musical instruments, allowing them to produce deep, resonant calls that could travel long distances. They lived in herds and communicated. They migrated to dedicated nesting grounds to lay their eggs, covering the nests with fermenting vegetation that generated heat to incubate the eggs from the outside, the same way some modern birds do today. And those eggs, the ones on the counter in Las Vegas, were a physical artifact of all of that. Somewhere in the late Cretaceous, a hadrosaur mother had laid those eggs carefully in a nest, covered them, and done everything in her power to give the creatures inside them a chance to survive. They didn't hatch. Something happened. A predator, a flood, a collapse of the nest site, and those eggs were buried and mineralized and preserved across 75 million years of geological time, until a construction crew in China dug them up, and someone put them in a box, and they traveled across the world to end up on a counter in Las Vegas. A creature that raised its young, that migrated, that communicated, that survived in a world where T-Rex was the apex predator, and those were its eggs, sitting under fluorescent lights in a pawn shop. So what does a moment like that actually sell for? Corey made his offer. The expert turned to Corey and gave him a number: $300 to $600 per egg, not per pair. Not because they weren't real, but because of something that no amount of ancient history could overcome: supply and demand. The black market flood of the early 1990s had permanently changed the landscape. A Dendrolithus hadrosaur egg from China, regardless of how extraordinary the concept of it was, had become, in the language of the collector's market, common. Corey opened at $400 for both eggs. The seller pushed back. They went back and forth briefly, and eventually landed on $500 for the pair. Two objects that had survived the mass extinction event that ended the Cretaceous period, outlasted every human civilization in history, traveled illegally across international borders, and sat in someone's possession long enough to end up at the gold and silver pawn shop, and they sold for $500. Less than a decent hotel room on the Las Vegas Strip for one night. Less than a pair of courtside NBA tickets. Less than a bottle of wine at some of the restaurants 3 blocks away. And yet, Corey wasn't unhappy about it, because he understood something the seller probably hadn't thought about. Those eggs weren't going to sell based on paleontology. They were going to sell because they were the greatest conversation piece in the history of coffee tables. Because you could look someone in the eye and say, completely casually, as if it weren't the most extraordinary sentence in the English language, "That's a real dinosaur egg," and watch their faces do something they couldn't control. Now, in 2026, the market picture is a little more nuanced than it was in 2014. Current fossil collector sites list real dinosaur eggs ranging anywhere from $500 to $10,000, with prices climbing sharply for specimens that are rare in species, unusually large, in exceptional condition, or, most significantly, contain a fossilized embryo inside the shell. A hadrosaur egg with a visible embryo can fetch prices that dwarf what Corey paid. But a standard Dendrolithus egg from China, the kind that flooded the market in the 90s? It still sits at the lower end of that range. The supply hasn't gone away. The market hasn't forgotten. As for Pawn Stars itself, the show is a very different animal in 2026. Corey Harrison, who bought those eggs and joked that he was going to tell Chumlee they were about to hatch, left Las Vegas in September 2024 and moved to Tulum, Mexico. He will not be part of the show going forward. His father, Rick Harrison, and longtime cast member Austin Chumlee Russell are set to relaunch Pawn Stars with new episodes planned for 2027. Rick, meanwhile, got married in January 2026 at the Little White Chapel in Las Vegas, with an Elvis impersonator officiating, which is frankly the most on-brand thing that has ever happened to anyone connected to this show. The Gold and Silver Pawn Shop is still open, still one of the most visited tourist destinations in Las Vegas. And here is the one thing about Pawn Stars that almost nobody knows. The shop you see on television isn't the real shop. It's a copy. A duplicate studio was built behind the scenes because the show's popularity made filming on the actual floor impossible. The real transactions happen in the real building next door, away from cameras, exactly as they always have. So in a show built entirely on the idea of telling you what things are really worth, the setting itself turned out to be a replica, which, strangely, fits perfectly with the story of two dinosaur eggs that were real and old and extraordinary, but had been put together by someone who wanted them to look like more than they were. Didn't the owner of the eggs get ripped off, given that the Pawn Stars might sell it with a story and for more? At what point does "I just love this stuff" stop being an excuse when it comes to the fossil black market? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.